Moshi Moshi. Let's talk about the future. Hi, I'm Kristy Bird MaKieve, and I'm the CEO and founder of Evergood Consultants and Evergood Podcast, which is what we're doing today. The podcast is all about healthcare, education, innovation. But today we're going to really focus on the future of your organization. And a lot of the spaces that I've been working in the last 10 years have been around, new nonprofits, new startups, and that, it takes a lot of really creative problem solving to create uh, a sustainable income, a revenue for that organization to thrive. And I will say that I also was working with nonprofits that had been around since the late 1800s, but had a very particular need to raise money. And so I'll probably go into that a little bit later on. So a lot of folks also are never really in the space of wondering where the operating budget monies come from, or that you need to sort of build those up in order to be sustainable. There's what I would call a lot of folks who are on the program delivery end, in the nonprofit space in particular, and so you're not quite aware that. Like with other entities where there's some sort of revenue stream already baked into the equation, that there are some organizations, particularly nonprofits, that don't have a sustainable operating budget, and that there are some things that you can do to put that in place. And why is that important? So we're going to start with that, which is that the future of your organization really depends upon having paid staff. And typically employees are the biggest expense of an organization. There's a living wage, there's a minimum wage, there's having people with the right skill set to make the good decisions of running your organization. Things like, is somebody capable of creating designs and communications that are effective and can help deliver the message that you're trying to deliver? That's everything from donations to awareness building to getting people to get involved, especially with volunteers in the nonprofit space. You need somebody who knows what they're doing technology wise. And you definitely need somebody who knows about HR. And it's really tough to find all of that expertise in one person. And so then ideally you want to have more than one person in your organization, at least part-time. And when I talk about the nonprofit space and driving revenue, this is actually true for for-profit organizations as well. You have to have that predictable income, as much as anything is predictable in this world, so that you can then have an operating budget, a board, and the lead staff people hash out what that operating budget should be. And usually by November, December, there's a clear plan for the following year already set to spend the money that aligns with your mission and your vision. But if you don't have that money to begin with, what do you do? So we're going to talk about that today really briefly. This is more of a tutorial, and it is related to healthcare education innovation because I am now working with a nonprofit that is affiliated with a medical association, much like what I was doing in the last 6 years, but down in the Santa Cruz area. And it's really exciting, but the 501(c)(3) is in need of a sustainable operating budget. And so as I was working through my thoughts for them, I figured I would record this and share it with you all. So basically, you need money to do your work. Nonprofits are really built on volunteers to do a lot of the work. For example, tomorrow is Thanksgiving. My family and I always do the Run to Feed the Hungry here in Sacramento. It's amazing. It's a lot of fun. And I end up buying registrations for several family members and not really knowing whether they're going to show up or not. But that's okay, right? It's a donation to the organization that is bringing food to the people of Sacramento. So it's a very worthwhile endeavor and happy to donate that money. And uh, so it's Thanksgiving, and on that topic, I just want to say how thankful I am for nonprofits and all the work that is done, and that this is a really great time of year to consider supporting your favorite nonprofit, and especially something that's a new nonprofit doing really good work that you believe in. And yet you haven't donated to them in the past. Well, you know what? Give them a chance because um, again, what I'm this entire tutorial is about is how do you sustain an organization in the good work that it does, and that is through revenue. So volunteers are fantastic. I got my Run to Feed the Hungry t-shirts and bibs and everything to participate tomorrow. And it was this like huge number of volunteers who were making sure that all of us who have registered get what we need in a timely fashion. And it was just so impressive. And volunteers are really important for nonprofits and any community sort of service and work. But without paid staff, your organization is not going to thrive. So I am a certified association executive, CAE for short, and that is through the association, no, sorry, the American Society of Association Executives, ASAE, and in partnership with the local nonprofit called Associations West. And we all are big nonprofit nerds where we really like to understand how things work. And every training that I've been in, every workshop, it is clear that if you are only volunteer run and you don't have paid staff, the sustainability of your organization is going to fail. I mean, there are some that thrive, but like very few in the long run. And you look at that arc of time, it is inevitable that without paid professional staff, your organization will not thrive. And so then, maybe you're a nonprofit that's been running with volunteers only for decades, and this is a conversation of like, how do you change that trajectory? Um, so I wanted to say that you really have to look at a diversified um, financial plan. Um, and by diversification, I would just encourage you to think of a pie chart. And the pie chart can be different pie shapes, right? It doesn't have to be 33%, 33%, and 33% rounded up to 100%. It could be 20% and 80%. It could be a variety of different numbers, but whatever it is, the whole operating budget should reflect three different areas. One is grants, and I think that's very familiar to nonprofits. The grants are fantastic. They do help make the organizations, it's possible for those organizations to do the work that they want to do. Unfortunately, though, grants do have a time limit. It might be a 10-year grant with 1 year renewals and then a 5 year like reapplication. And it could be a 1 year grant. It might be a 6 months, that really small grant. But and I just there is a caveat to grants, which is that very very low indirects and overhead are allowed. And so what indirects and overhead do is fund the actual operations of the organization. And so if all you have are grants, then you're going to have a very finite time frame where you can count on that sustainable funding source. Um, There's one grant that I'm very fond of. It's from the federal government, and it's the Drug-Free Communities Grant. It helped fund a coalition in Chico, which is where my last job was. And it was $125,000 a year, but they only allowed 6% indirect. Like this grant really wanted all of that money to go to the actual work. And so it was really designed for counties who have this sort of like operating budget that comes from other sources. Um, but happy that a nonprofit was able to step into that space because that particular grant had a 10-year limit on who could actually run the grant. And so the county had run it for 10 years. And then the nonprofit that I was founding in 2020 started to take on that grant because it had to sunset with the county. And then it was a very interesting discussion because we this was a nonprofit now running it, and there was no revenue behind the scenes to pay for like my salary, and I was the only staff person at the time, and that grant offered very little in terms of what could cover the overhead of an administrator, keeping the lights on in the office and things like that. But it's a great grant doing great work, and I'm hopeful that the federal government can find ways to bring that back to the organizations that were doing the good work. So grants are good, but they're only one piece of that pie. I guess I'm talking about pie because tomorrow's Thanksgiving and I need to go bake our pie. I call it the pie. It's really delicious. It has cranberries, Granny Smith apples, currants, really tasty pie. Okay, but back to the diversified revenue stream pie that we should be all striving for. The other part of that pie should be an invested fund. And I'm going to go into greater detail of what that means. It could be an endowment, but an endowment has very specific legal implications, whereas you could have an invested fund, and that has the same spin-off each year and the ability to sort of manage the funds that then go into the operating budget of the organization. And then the third piece of the pie that I have in my mind about what makes an organization sustainable is sponsorships and other fundraising. It's it can be tricky. When I say sponsorships, that's very much a part of what should be happening in an organization, but it could also be under a category of like events. Let's just say you have a golf tournament and it's very successful and it generates a good $50,000 a year for your nonprofit. That goes into the sponsorship category. I think sponsorships are like grants, though. They don't last forever. Organizations change. Maybe they go, well, I'm not going to sponsor that golf tournament. I'm going to create my own golf tournament. And we're going to create our own foundation at this hospital. So therefore, we are not going to give our sponsorship dollars to your golf tournament anymore. It is very labor intensive, which goes back to needing paid staff. So it's a tricky piece of that pie, but I do think for nonprofits, it is an important piece of the pie. Sort of going above expenses to then have a net profit for your organization. I'm going to pause there, take my little sidestep. I take a lot of sidesteps. Sorry about that. I want to be very, very clear that a nonprofit does not mean that you don't have profit. A nonprofit means that it's a whole tax category, and that you're not a corporation with shareholders. The corporation with shareholders is all about driving revenue and profits to the shareholders. That's a corporate setup. It is just what it is. And it's why I've always been attracted to the nonprofit space, which is that you're kind of doing the work of society, community needs, and the good work that I consider And it's not to say that corporations don't. I'm a big fan of corporate social responsibility. And I think that that's a great space to be in. But oftentimes the link is back to sponsorships, where that corporation then sponsors the work of the nonprofit so that the nonprofit's doing the work. And again, you have to have money to pay the people to do the good work in the nonprofit. And that you should always be building a profit for a nonprofit because that is basically meeting inflation. And then we're going to go into the investment fund, right? So it's you do have to put money into the organization, and you always have to have money to grow money. And so let's take a dive into what an invested fund can do for an organization. And I was actually just mapping this out because compounded interest is it's funny. So a basic premise is that you have, let's just take $1 million because that's a round number that I can work with. And so you have $1 million that is invested in the stock market. And then there's a whole diversification of how that money should or could be invested. And if you have $1 million that you want to invest in the stock market in any way, shape, or form, $1 million, and I would even say 500,000 or more, you should be paying a professional to manage that money. There is no such thing as a one and done sort of investment strategy. And here's why. Yes, there is long-term gains by having invested, like say in mutual funds where you have less fees that you have to pay. However, the stock market is not fixed. It changes every single day. And there's ways to, when you have a certain amount of money invested, to harvest the gains by selling when stocks are down, right? You buy low and you sell high. And those of us who are busy professionals, it doesn't matter what profession you're in, being on top of all of that all the time in a diverse investment portfolio, in which if you had $1 million and it's not in a diversified investment portfolio, then you're kind of really at the whims of one particular stock or you're like sort of in a really low yield bond. So you gotta have a diversified portfolio. You need to have somebody who's really managing that. And I did the calculations. If it's like you have to pay somebody $10,000 a year to ensure that you're growing 8 to 12% per year, and that's so that $1 million is then increasing every year 8 to 12%. You're gonna make back that money, and you're definitely going to make back that money in times when there's a stock market downturn. And you're going to be able to be more on the 12% return end more than the 8% return end. That's not always a guarantee. There's no hard and fast rules, but you are more likely to make money from your money if you pay a paid professional. Okay, so back to the $1 million. And really simply, what you're trying to do is grow that money 8 to 12% every year and taking off 4%. So then you can calculate that have $1 million, it grows 4% every year. And then you add that to the $1 million. Then the next year, it's $1 million plus that 4%, then making 4% more. And why I'm saying 4% is because we're going to go with the assumption that it's 8% growth and that you're taking out 4% every year. And so 4% is remaining in its growth to keep growing. Now it could be 12% growth, and then the investment compound interest is even greater, which is phenomenal. So, you know, when you look at the fundraising that you need to do, you can break it down into smaller bite-sized pieces. Okay, so that's my strategy in life. Is like when things seem really big and overwhelming, it's like, how do I break it down? into steps over time, because then you are more likely to achieve that goal. So let's just say you want to make 1.5 million in 3 years' time. So that's 500,000 each year for 3 years. Now, 500,000 is like, okay, we could do that. We could do that. It might still seem a little bit daunting, but then when you're in that fundraising space, you could consider that 500,000, maybe it comes from a sponsor. So in the medical association world, maybe your medical society has enough membership dues, which is driving the 501c6 medical association. Those are professional organizations that can charge membership dues. And then if there's enough of that revenue and there's a subsidiary 501c3, then you as a board and your staff leadership can decide, okay, we're going to give $50,000 a year over 10 years to the subsidiary 501c3 nonprofit. And then that's part of that fundraising goal, and making that nonprofit sustainable. Not all 501c3s are blessed with a wealthy medical association. And so that's just one way to think about how to get to a 500,000 per year goal of, for 3 years, raising 1.5 million. And then when you do the calculations of that 1.5 million over 10 years being invested in an 8 to 12%, fairly high growth investment fund. I'm just quickly looking at my chart here that I did. I did all the compound interest. So it starts to make at $1 million a year at 4%, 40,000. So then in year three, you have 500,000, 500,000, 500,000. So then plus 40,000 a year, 40,000 of compound interest from year one. So then you are basically at 1,540,000, and 4% of that is 61,000. So you've grown in 1 year's time your investment fund by 20,000. So then when you calculate that all over time, so not adding any more fundraising after year three and just calculating the compound interest, you would grow that fund to 2 million by the 10th year, with 4% being $81,000 a year. Now, $81,000 a year can really make a difference for a nonprofit operating budget. And so it's really important to make sure that you have some sort of an investment fund that is then generating income and growing over time. And so that's why it's a really important piece of your pie chart for building out that operating fund. Again, you should be looking at growth of 8 to 12% per year. You should be paying somebody to manage it so you're getting the 12%, and really paying attention to those daily swings in the market. And then you should be looking to spin off 4%, which then still enables that growth of 4 to 8%, depending on how much return on investment you're getting with that. So then you're breaking down 500,000 per year. You're looking at those different ways to get to that so that you can sock that money away into an investment fund. The other beauty of an investment fund is that, right, I just described how you can take 150,000, and sorry, 150,000, no, sorry, 1.5 million, and grow it to 2 million in 10 years just by having it invested. And then it's a rainy day fund, right? So something terrible happens in the stock market. Maybe your industry has some dire situation that's happening. Like, right, we're in healthcare right now, and healthcare seems like, canceling Medicaid could be very, very devastating to a lot of communities. So maybe there's you need to take some of the money out of that investment, and give it someplace else. But that is why you would want to have an investment fund in the first place. It's both spinning off every year, but it's also there for a rainy day. Okay, so I am going to talk a little bit about that fundraising. Raising $500,000 a year for 3 years is actually really a big deal. Um, I am going to pause though, because I just remembered what I really wanted to say. So I've done a lot of thinking about how do you get enough money to make a nonprofit sustainable, or even a small business. And I think $70,000 a year to me is the bare minimum that you should have in revenue, in your operating budget. And that's hard for some organizations. Believe me, I've been in the space. I totally know it. But $70,000 a year could be attainable if you do the 1.5 million investment and the fundraising that goes with that. But 70,000 is actually a part-time person, a paid, skilled professional to be the CEO and make the decisions and do the fundraising and make those connections that are going to make the organization grow and thrive. It costs. You have to be competitive. The knowledgeable folks are retiring, and the old way of sort of paying a nonprofit, they don't need to make money. No, that's not true anymore. You really do need to have paid professionals. And remember earlier I said you need like an HR person and a tech person. Well, those folks are not minimum wage, right? So the reality is a $70,000 a year could make things work. I'm thinking back to 2019, and I was running this tiny medical society in Chico, and we were paying $400 a month in rent, I believe, if my memory serves me right. And it was like a little room, and we were able to use the conference room. But the conference room wasn't big enough to bring all of our board members together. And then the technology was a little bit old. There was no broadband, I think, in the conference room. And so then as we pivoted toward virtual or hybrid meetings, it was increasingly challenging to hold those meetings in that conference room. But in the end, I was hiring people, and we would not fit in that office space. And as soon as I hired one person, even part-time, I had to expand the rent because I needed, $400 was like the bare minimum, right? And I know I get it. We're in California, but I'm pretty sure we're talking about the vast majority of this country. So, anyway, again, 70,000 would really be the base minimum. You also should have some benefits in addition to salary for professionals. There's a lot of folks in the space who are like, well, we don't need benefits for whatever reason. But honestly, to be competitive, you should be offering at least some sort of a retirement account, which costs money, right? So, payroll services, you have to pay somebody to manage your payroll. It 70,000 is like bare minimum. I do think an ideal goal for any nonprofit is 150,000. 150,000 allows you to have maybe two part-time people or a full-time person plus two part-time people. It allows you to get the skill sets that you need to run that organization and to grow it, right? You need money to make money. You need paid people to ensure that you're getting the grants that are coming in, to do the fundraising so that you hit your investment fund growth goals, and that you're tracking down those sponsorships that really do help the organization do its work. Um, and so I'm just saying, 150,000, just that's your goal, bare minimum, uh, for being a functional nonprofit. 70,000 if you just kind of want to keep the status quo, and maybe you're looking to close the doors in 20 years. Because again, inflation. And while you may not be paying now at the rates that are going to be, or the, inflation rates in 10 years' time, you have to be building toward that. What about cost of living increases? Nonprofits should benefit from cost of living adjustments just as I get a paid corporation. Because guess what? Inflation affects us all. And so if you're not actually looking at growth for your nonprofit, you're looking to eventually close it down. It could be 50 years, it could be 20 years, but if eventually you're in the downward death spiral with that. So I'm gonna I'm really gonna talk about fundraising now, and I'm going to say something that might be a little bit painful to hear if you're operating in this mindset. But I'm going to call it the bake sale approach. And there are many who are still working on that bake sale approach. And that is to raise money for a specific fund, period. So let's just say it's a medical association that wants to give scholarships for students who are pursuing medicine. It's a big deal. It's very important. It really does help and helps to um, push youth through a very long education journey. Medicine is like a really tough career, lots of obstacles to getting in. And so, why not give a $2,000 award to a deserving high school student or a medical student or a pre-med student, right? $2,000 actually does make a big difference. And so then you look at, well, okay, board of this nonprofit or, you know, community members, we need to raise $2,000 to give this award. Absolutely. However, if your organization doesn't have that full diversified pie that I was talking about earlier, gosh, I'm getting hungry. Keeping talking about this pie, the investment fund, the grants, the sponsorships. Without that as your base, you're basically just raising money and solving one small problem. Um, and the reason I say it's a bake sale is because I think these used to be very prevalent. I think they still are. But basically, you're selling a dollar item. Maybe you sell 50 of them, and that's $50. It's not going to move the needle, right? You're gonna get $50 that can then go toward a $2,000 scholarship. You still have to raise. You have to do all this other work to raise the money. And honestly, without if you had that invested fund and it's spinning off 4%, and then you put into your operating budgets, like if you have the 150,000, there should be a line item of $2,000 for that scholarship forevermore. So then you can concentrate your fundraising efforts on bigger pieces of fundraising and then growing that portfolio and nurturing the relationships with those who can give more, or maybe it's planned giving where they put they say, well, my house is gonna, I don't have any children, so my house is gonna go toward this nonprofit that I really care about, and then that is sold and turns into a nice cash gift for the organization. So it is I'm not dissing bake sales. I think they're really, really important, but very specific small fundraising is going to lead to burnout. And if I could buy a cupcake for a dollar rather than write a check for 100,000 or $100, heck yeah, I'm going to do that. So anyway, I will talk about my friends in Chico, and I don't want to give their identity away because they're wonderful people doing wonderful things. But it's basically a simulation center that is educating the next healthcare workforce or keeping them up to skill levels per their profession. But anyway, the simulation center had a very small operating budget, but they were very successful at saying, look, we need to raise $50,000 to buy a mannequin. And because I don't know if you know about simulation centers, but there's some really amazing mannequins out there, very expensive. And some could be 20,000, some could be 50,000. But then they can train the next generations of the healthcare workforce for many, many years. And then you're getting that simulation education before actually going to work on patients. So win-win from my perspective. Uh, and so I was invited to be on their board, and I loved being up there to do that. But it was very sad to me when I saw that their executive director needed to retire, and there was barely enough money to pay this person a living wage. But it also set them up for how do you recruit somebody in 2025 and pay them a competitive salary with that specialized expertise in running a simulation center. I mean, I don't have that skill set, do you? And so you want to pay somebody and have benefits and you know anyway, they had the bake sale mentality, which is what I call it, and I'm sorry, but you know, focused on raising money for one particular item and being successful in that, but then still struggling to have money for the operating budget and to pay the staff that was needed. I think there was also need to grow staff because it was an intensive amount of work. And the technology piece of that particular organization was very specialized. And so you would need to hire and pay people a good salary to recruit that expertise. Okay, so I have covered a lot. I think for all of my recommendations for anyone listening to this podcast is really about the needs of your organization and then tailoring your fundraising in a way that makes sense. So it could be that you have an operating budget and you do need to do the bake sale work. But I think it's a little bit more challenging for those who are new nonprofits or transitioning into, just having only grants and then needing to build out the diversified revenue streams. Again, it's an invested fund and those sponsorships that really do make sure that your organization is sustainable and that you should always be having an operating budget that mirrors your expenses. And in my last position, I was founding a new nonprofit that was quickly growing to $5 to $6 million a year. And so within a very short amount of time and just having grants, it was clear that fundraising needed to happen so that you could reasonably ensure that if something happened, there was $5 or $6 million to pay those bills, and to make sure that all of the agreements with the entities that might be driving that money are in place and solid and dependable. And that then when you have that $5 to $6 million invested fund, it is there as a rainy day. It's spinning off monies for the operating budget, but it's also there in case there's a rainy day and the money needs to be tapped in order to pay the bills. So, um, all all good stuff. And tomorrow being Thanksgiving, I just have a huge thank you to anyone and everyone who works in a nonprofit. It is definitely the good work of our society. It's not, we're the ones really thinking through and problem solving societies and our communities' greatest needs. And but it's not easy, and it is definitely not easy when you don't have a sustainable revenue stream for your organization. So it's tough work, and I'm just so thankful for everybody who rolls up their sleeves and walks into that nonprofit space. So happy Thanksgiving. And again, if you're listening to this and you're not running a nonprofit, then do consider donating a significant amount of money to your favorite organization to make sure that their operating budget, their general fund, is sustainable to keep doing this good work forevermore. All right, happy Thanksgiving.
Lost my sense of humor, I found them too fun to know. Over grass, blow up kayaks, would have helped with angry toes, but it gave mashed potatoes. Take that meatloaf back, hi! Birthday dehydrated cake and lots of wine, so nice with clean dark hair. I think it's a waltz, I think it's a waltz, but I know it's the longest 2 miles of her. I think it's a waltz, I think it's a waltz, but I know